We left off talking about a revolution in female manners. This is Wollstonecraft's overall political proposal. What does it amount to? Wollstonecraft is saying that a revolution in female manners will be a radical improvement in everyday thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of all individuals, both men and women. It pertains to female manners insofar as this revolution is supposed to transform and to improve the relations between men and women. Okay, so that's what the female bit is about. And as you see here, it's a very peculiar kind of revolution. It doesn't have to do with changing the basic structure of government. It doesn't have to do with, well, which group or which class of people is in charge of that government. The revolution here is more cultural, or more to do with the values of a society, more to deal with its the kind of personalities that people have, more to do with the kinds of relations they have in everyday life. Another thing about this revolution, Wollstonecraft is writing at a time when she is really in a transition period. The transition period is where revolutionary politics has both meanings of cycling and cycling back, as well as going forward and moving along a straight line. So on the cyclical bit, Wollstonecraft is saying that all individuals have been endowed by their creator with natural rights. What Wollstonecraft is saying is that it's society which does not institutionalize or actualize those natural rights. So the presumption is against society here and social arrangements that oppress women. And that the job of this revolution in female manners is to restore women to their natural rights, the rights that all human beings should have, but for some reason or another, social reasons, only one half of the species is currently enjoying. So in that sense, the revolution is actually a restoration. So this usage of revolution is actually pretty close to what John Locke was saying a revolution was. It's a restoration of a prior and more satisfactory state of affairs. Okay, so that's the cyclical part of it. At the same time, Wollstonecraft thought that revolution was what moved individuals, societies, and ultimately all of humankind forward. And that's the linear aspect of it. It's the progressive aspect of revolution. And in this sense, what Wollstonecraft is saying is this revolution in female manners is going to bring about societies where sex relations are egalitarian in a way that humankind has not seen before. So the ultimate result is new. It's not a circling or a cycling back. It's a movement forward. It's a new stage of humanity. Okay, so Wollstonecraft has got both these ideas in her idea of revolution. Revolution involves both men and women. You can't change the meanings of masculinity and femininity independently of one another. You can't change the meaning of what it means to be a woman without at the same time changing the meaning of what it means to be a man. And vice versa. You can't change the meaning of what it means to be a man without changing the meaning, the cultural meaning of being a woman. Okay, and it would be a very impartial and very incomplete and a very tenuous revolution indeed if only women's attitudes about women changed, if only women's feelings about women changed, and if only women's behaviors towards their own sex or the opposite sex changed. For the entire society to change, men too will have to change their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors regarding sexual relations, regarding the relations between men and women. This is it's almost a logical point. You can't define men as superior without having a point of comparison. And the problem is, in patriarchal societies, men's superior status has been built upon the inferior status of women. Okay, so if you're really going to say women are equals, then their status has to change. It has to be more egalitarian, it has to be more of an equal status. And then attitudes towards women also have to change. That's not the example Wollstonecraft herself uses, so let me actually just talk about one of the biggest examples for Wollstonecraft. It's marriage. It's marriage. So it's not just the generic relationship between men and women. Wollstonecraft is very keen on changing relations between husbands and wives. Very keen. Because, you know, back then, marriage rates were higher, divorce rates were lower, it was hard to get a divorce legally and so forth. Okay, so Wollstonecraft is saying, if you were going to change the everyday sex relations, and remember, for Wollstonecraft, sex includes sexuality, gender, sex, all these ideas that we now have separate terms for. These are all just compressed into this term sex for Wollstonecraft. But if you're going to change everyday sex relationships, where are you going to start? Where do most of the people spend most of their time? Well, in the household. And how are most of these household arrangements set up? Well, they're set up in terms of these marriages, heterosexual, monogamous, and the like. Okay, so let's work on the marriages. That's what Wollstonecraft is proposing. And what Wollstonecraft is basically proposing is that a lasting marriage is based on character. And a lasting marriage is based on the respect you have for your partner's character. A lasting marriage is, it's kind of a friendship, as Wollstonecraft is going to put it on the next slide. What she's opposed to is this newfangled idea, because it was pretty new in the 18th century, Wollstonecraft's time, that marriage should be based on romance and love. It's a newfangled idea because for most of human history, as most of us know, I think, marriages were actually relationships not between individuals who fell in love with each other. And that was the new ideal, one of the new ideals of the 18th century. Marriage was understood to be a relationship between families. And often the marriages were arranged by parents, by professional matchmakers, maybe by religious figures, maybe by village elders and so forth. It wasn't really the choice of the individuals to get married, and it wasn't supposed to be based on love. Okay, so Wollstonecraft knows that some of the people of her time are saying this idea of love marriage, of romantic marriage, is actually the way forward, is actually the progressive ideal. And Wollstonecraft has her doubts. Wollstonecraft has her doubts. She says love is too irrational and unstable of passion to build a marriage, a long-lasting marriage, a stable marriage on. Because when most people are talking about love and love at first sight and kind of these Romeo and Juliet situations where teenagers fall in love instantly, what Wollstonecraft is saying is that's really not love. That's more like lust. I think that's the gist of what she's saying. And she's also saying, even if that lust is real, it's a momentary thing. And it's not even based on the character of the person. You have really no idea when you fall in love, quote unquote, at first sight, what that person is like, what their character is like, how they conduct themselves in everyday life. And for that reason, you have no reason to either respect or esteem them in a moral sense. All you've done is said, I see something I like it, let's go for it. Okay, so Wollstonecraft is saying that marriage is less a romantic thing and more of a long-term partnership or a long-term friendship. And these phrases we use today, like saying my partner instead of my husband or wife, Wollstonecraft would be in approval of those kinds of phrases, because one of the things that Wollstonecraft likes is these terms that express a kind of equality and a kind of egalitarianism. And I think she would like this term partnership, not only because it's less gendered than husband and wife, but also because it has this idea, you know, if you're partners, yeah, there may be junior or senior partners. There may be some inequality, but you're basically equal. And it's the same difference with friendship, Wollstonecraft would say. For Wollstonecraft, friendship has got to be based on morality. It's got to be based on the features and the qualities of the soul and the character. It's not based on the body, and it's not based on physical attractiveness primarily. Okay, although that doesn't hurt. What Wollstonecraft would say is, it's the same difference with friendship. If the friendship is too unequal, there's going to be resentment. If the friendship is too unequal, it becomes less of a friendship thing and more of one person bossing the other person around. That's really not a recipe for marital success, Wollstonecraft would say. Friends have got to be independent and equal. So now we're really getting into Wollstonecraft's ideal of what a society that comes out from the other side of this revolution in female manners would look like. It would be a society of independent and equal individuals. I think that's the basic formula. And Wollstonecraft is saying we've got to just start doing and start making that new kind of society. The society that will be post-revolutionary right now, while we're undertaking this revolution in female manners. Okay, so just do it. Just do it right now. Do it in your own household. Do it with your partner. Okay, so what is this ideal of independence? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. The idea of independence is somebody with their own purposes, who exist for their own sake, and who can choose to enter into friendships or marriages with other people to pursue common ends. Okay, so that's the independence bit. What is the equality bit? We've already kind of talked about the equality bit. The equality bit means that the two people who are engaged in this friendship and who are engaging in social relationships and sexual relationships and so forth are roughly on the same level. They're roughly on the same level. Wollstonecraft is living in a very class stratified society. Wollstonecraft is living in a very class conscious society. And she sees these relations between people of upper and lower classes, I almost said castes, maybe some of that's in there, insofar as class is often hereditary, class status is often hereditary. She sees these relationships as degrading everybody involved. They're degrading and humiliating for everyone involved. It's all flattery and submission on one side, and it's all haughtiness and arrogance on the other. Those are not morally good relationships, Wollstonecraft is saying. And she's saying the problem with most marriages of her time and her place that she's observed in France and the United Kingdom and other European countries, she was in Scandinavian countries for a while too. The problem with those European marriages of her time is they're structured too much like master-servant relationships. They're put together too much like one person exists, has his own purposes, pursues his aims, And the idea is the other person exists to help out the first person. The other person, let's say the wife, exists to help the husband accomplish his aims. The other person doesn't really have aims of her own. The other person is more like a helper or a servant for the first person, who is more like a master. And what Wollstonecraft is saying is, why is it in so many households the wife is seen as a kind of upper servant to the master of the house? That, for Wollstonecraft, is not an ideal marriage. Similarly, here Wollstonecraft's rhetoric is kind of harsh, but this is what she's saying, and it's definitely not pro-sex work. Wollstonecraft is saying too many of these husband and wife pairings, their relationship is structured like the relationship between a provider and a dependent. The provider is the one who gets the income, provides the food and the shelter and the clothing and so forth. They're the provider for the household. And then everyone else, including another grown adult who happens to be of the opposite sex, is a dependent. And this ties back into this ideal of service, that the wife is supposed to serve the provider. The wife is supposed to listen to what the provider says, take instructions, take suggestions, take commands to carry those out. And among the services that the wife is supposed to provide for the husband are sexual services. Sexual in the sense of sexuality. And what Wollstonecraft is saying is, isn't that a kind of problematic relationship? Because basically what you're saying is the wife has to provide sexual services in order to be provided for. Isn't that more or less legal prostitution? Okay, and I'm not saying her attitude towards prostitution is right, but it's not a favorable one. So, Wollstonecraft's idea is that this revolution in female manners will begin in the home and at the school. So, we're going to talk more about Wollstonecraft's proposal for national schools, national public schools, next week in our last Wollstonecraft lecture. That's chapter 12. Right now, we're talking about the revolution begins at home. Okay, it doesn't begin out in the streets. It doesn't begin in the halls of government. It starts at home with people shaping their character and their conduct. It begins at home with relations like husband and wife relations, mother-daughter, mother-son, husband-daughter, husband-son, and so forth. So you want to start with that family unit, Wollstonecraft says. And then Wollstonecraft says, once you've got that basis or foundation set in the household, now you've got some grounds for extending the revolution into other sectors of society. So Wollstonecraft says, once people get used to egalitarian relations between boys and girls at school, once they get used to egalitarian relations between husbands and wives in the household, well, then it's not going to be that strange if they go into a workplace, say a hospital, and they see women doctors as well as men doctors, instead of the arrangements which would have been more common insofar as public hospitals and so forth existed, between all the doctors are men, all the women are nurses. Wollstonecraft would say, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Are you telling me every woman there has had a full opportunity to pursue the doctor position? And furthermore, that every man there would be better suited to be a doctor than a nurse? Okay, so the workplace. That's one place the revolution has to be extended into. And of course, Wollstonecraft also thinks that the revolution has to be extended into government. Wollstonecraft says, and this is chapter 9, this was not assigned, so I'm just kind of telling you what's there. Wollstonecraft says, maybe I'll be ridiculed for this, but I think that women should have the right to vote. Now, this was a radical idea Suffrage later became, in the 19th century, one of the major claims of the organized feminist movement. Wollstonecraft is writing a little before the organized feminist movement, but she's definitely thinking in that direction. So Wollstonecraft is saying, why is it that only men get the right to vote? Okay, well, some of the objectors, the patriarchy objects, well, because they're not educated and so forth, which for Wollstonecraft is just another argument for educating women. Okay, if women aren't educated enough to use the vote, why not educate women? That would seem to make sense if women are also rational creatures and capable of being equal and independent. Okay, and Wollstonecraft's not going to stop with the vote. Wollstonecraft says, I one day imagine that there will be female women members of parliament. And why not? And why not? Because if it's really true that there's really only one kind of soul, and the kind of body of the member of parliament really isn't the main thing or even relevant at all, why not have women members of parliament? This is very much in the spirit of what Plato was saying about why not female guardians. Okay, and I have two things I want to talk about regarding Vindication of the Rights of Women, chapter 4 and 7. First is Wollstonecraft's argument that reason is progressive. Reason is progressive. Okay, and this is one of the reasons she likes reason. Second thing I want to talk about is the virtue for Wollstonecraft. We hear a lot about the virtues, morality, and all this, but what is Wollstonecraft actually talking about? Well, she's talking about modesty. Modesty. And so we're going to close out this week's lectures with some discussion of Wollstonecraft's concept of modesty. Let's start with reason, though. Reason is progressive. Reason is progressive. What is reason? Wollstonecraft gives a pithy, a short definition of reason in chapter 4. She says that reason is the power of generalizing based on many observations. So, as I was saying last Wednesday, this past Wednesday, reason has got two orientations, let's call it, for Wollstonecraft. The first has to do with immaterial things, like your soul and going on to heaven. Okay, so that's not the material world. And let's call that the vertical dimension of reason. That's just a metaphor because obviously heaven's not literally above, according to Christian faith and so forth. It's a whole nother realm of existence. Okay. There's also more of a horizontal dimension to reason. Horizontal reason is just using your observations to see the patterns in social life, for example. So when you saw Wollstonecraft talking about, well, are you so sure that women's characters are just natural when there's so much gender socialization, when there's so much training and teaching to get them to act a certain way? That was Wollstonecraft using her reason to ask a question about things she's observed, which are observable differences, observable sex differences between boys and girls, men and women. Okay, so it was reason that was posing that question. And then when you saw Wollstonecraft making arguments that it's not nature that is to account for much of this behavior, but it's rather nurture, she was using her reason to draw relations between certain observations she saw, certain observations she made. She observed that if you train somebody and you do it daily and you really drill that training into them, they're going to start acting in a certain way. And Wollstonecraft's argument was soldiers being trained for obedience, aristocrats being trained to care about their physical appearance. And if women are also obeying and women are also caring about their physical appearance, it's not their sex that makes them do that. It's the fact that they're being trained up for a job. It's job training, in other words. So That's Wollstonecraft drawing relationships between things she's observed. She's observed aristocrats, she's observed soldiers, she's observed women. What do they all have in common? They get trained. They get trained for a job. And why would you be surprised that women's job training shapes their character and shapes their behavior? It even shapes the way they think and feel. Okay, so that's the use of reason. Reason, Wollstonecraft says, this power of generalizing based on making observations is what allows for improvement. Reason is our capacity for improvement. And this reason plays out at two levels, we could say. Reason in the soul allows us to perfect our soul. Reason in the soul allows us to improve our characters such that our characters can achieve certain virtues. Reason is what allows for moral improvement in the soul. Corresponding statement at the level of society is reason in society is what allows for social progress. So, what Wollstonecraft is thinking is entire societies, well, first of all, they consist of individuals, and that's why societies are capable of reason, because the parts of this whole have reason in their soul. Okay, so reason is at least potentially present in society. And the idea is societies go through a learning process. Societies go through a learning process. So at Wollstonecraft's time, and this is the French Revolutionary idea. This is also the American Revolutionary idea. The idea was monarchies per se are a problem. Monarchies per se are a problem. Monarchies lead to all sorts of abuses. Monarchies, monarchs often strive to be the absolute rulers of their kingdom. Monarchs are constantly infighting with their near relatives because there are these crises of succession. There's just all these problems tied up with monarchy. And Wollstonecraft would say part of what the revolutions of her day, and she would also say this of the 19th century revolutions that came after her, part of what those revolutions were teaching European societies was that monarchy is a problem. So at least these societies are learning what not to do. Okay, and they're passing through all these bloody revolutionary periods, all this revolutionary conflict, and they're coming out a little bit wiser on the other side of it. And that would be an example for Wollstonecraft of reason in society. So that's the good case. That's what Wollstonecraft hopes can happen, both for individuals and for society. And if you add all that up, if you change all the individuals, and if you change all of society, you've changed all of humankind. Okay, so really there are three levels for Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft thinks that reason is what allows the entire human species to progress. Some societies will be ahead of others in this progressive process. Some individuals will be ahead of others in this progressive process. But the idea is all of humankind is going to progress, and progress in a moral sense, not just the technological sense. Moral progress, that is Wollstonecraft's ideal. What's in the way of the path of progress? Well, as we've already seen, the catch-all is oppression. That's the problem. So oppression is anything that systematically blocks an individual's development, the individual's attempt to improve themselves. And degradation, Wollstonecraft says, exists on a social level too. Degradation is a kind of oppression. It's the moral way of explaining or articulating what oppression is. So degradation and oppression are very closely linked for Wollstonecraft. She often uses them synonymously, but basically what she's saying, Wollstonecraft is saying, is Degradation is whatever gets in the way of or puts artificial limits around our ability to use reason. That's degradation. And she says, you think that it's the poor people in your society who are morally degraded. And Wollstonecraft would not deny that. She thinks there's just too much degradation in the societies of her time and place. But what she's saying is, you can be in these splendid castles and wearing these fancy gowns and these fancy pants and still be in a state of degradation, a state of moral degradation. Why? Because your moral degradation is your inability to improve yourself using your own reason. And so Wollstonecraft does something quite counterintuitive. She does something pretty counterintuitive, which is she says that people like Louis XIV, he's one of these absolute monarch types in France, a relation of Louis XVI, the one who tried to reign over the French Revolution. Wollstonecraft discusses Louis XIV as a degraded character. So she's saying, why were people so impressed with Louis XIV? I'm on page 76 here. Was it by his extensive knowledge? Was it his exquisite judgment? Or by his heroic valor? What you notice here is Wollstonecraft saying, did this guy's character actually have virtues? Was he wise? Did he have extensive knowledge? Did he have exquisite judgment? That's one of the, remember, this discernment is one of the things that wisdom was traditionally understood to help with. Was it his heroic valor? Heroic valor just means courage. Was this a courageous person? Okay, so, you know, you got the ancient virtues here in the background of this passage. Wollstonecraft says it was by none of these qualities. But he was, first of all, the most powerful prince in Europe. Yeah, but just because you're powerful doesn't mean you're actually morally good. That's Wollstonecraft's sarcastic comment. Consequently, held the highest rank amongst kings. Okay, so people in a rank-obsessed society thought this guy was tops. Okay, great. And then she's quoting another author here. It's Voltaire, actually. He surpassed all his courtiers in the gracefulness of his shape and the majestic beauty of his features. He surpassed everybody else in this fancy pants aristocratic court life in his appearance, basically, his appearances. The sound of his voice, noble and affecting, gained those hearts which his presence intimidated. Here's your passions, your heart working without any reason. Why would your reason be impressed by the gracefulness of his shape and the majestic beauty of his features? These are things that Wollstonecraft is actually making fun of. Okay, and it goes on, and basically it's basically she's mocking the king, and she's saying he's a degraded kind of figure, and she's saying the rich are degraded. The rich are degraded, and she goes on to say, because once again she thinks this ideal of caring a lot about your appearance as a part of your job requirement, say of a wife, she's saying that caring a lot about your person and how you've been put together physically and so forth, that all comes from the rich. And so she says much of what we criticize women for example, hypocritically, Wollstonecraft would say, criticizing women for caring and preening too much about their looks and so forth, actually just comes from aristocratic society. Actually just comes from aristocrats like Louis XIV. So the question for Wollstonecraft, if she were alive today, would be, has there been improvement when it comes to moral degradation? Has there been improvement, most especially when it comes to progress in sexual relations? And here, I just want to show you guys some clips from the 20th century and the 21st century. And the question here is, have these images improved? have these images of women improved in a moral sense, the sense that Wollstonecraft cares about. So the first is from a 1930s Disney movie called Snow White. And the second is, I think it's a 20-teens movie, Disney movie as well, Disney princess movie as well. It's called Moana. Okay, so Wollstonecraft, I think, would have 2 points to make if she were asked to compare these clips. The first is, did you notice how in Moana, the princess is running and jumping and sliding on tree branches and jumping into ships and so on. And she's doing it by herself. And so she's basically expressing herself physically. And this goes back to Wollstonecraft's discussion of dolls. She says, why are these authors so sure that what young girls really want to do is stay at home and care for the dolls? She says, if you just let women express their natural impulses, I guarantee you these young girls would be romping around outside. She says something like, young girls are naturally, as much as boys, inclined towards physical exercise. Okay, so that's one thing. And then if you compare that to what's going on in the Snow White clip, you notice that the physical posture, Snow White's comportment, how she carries herself, is a lot, well, basically less physically active. It's a lot less expressive. It's a lot less extroverted. Okay, not that she's not expressing herself through the body, but just the way she's doing it is a little more reserved. Too reserved, I think Wollstonecraft would say. And what is Moana singing about while she's leaping and jumping and sailing and so on? She's singing about her thinking about her life and thinking about what she actually wants and thinking about how she wants to be basically a sailor and an explorer, and she's not so sure about the assigned role of princess. This is one of the actual big conflicts in the Moana movie. It's like, does Moana really want to be a Disney princess? And in the end, she figures out you can combine the roles of princess and explorer, and it's a happy ending. By contrast, what is Snow White singing about? I know it might have been a little hard to hear the volume on songs back in the 30s. The sound technology wasn't as great, but if you couldn't hear it, she was singing, "Someday my prince will come." What does she want out of her life? She wants to meet the prince. Okay, so when Moana is thinking about what do I want for myself, she's thinking about what she wants to do with her life in an independent way, you know, coming back to this idea of independence and equality. Whereas Snow White was saying, well, what do I want in my life? I want to meet Prince Charming. And so, like, her goal, and in fact, the goal of the movie is to get Snow White and her prince together. And it's an entirely different kind of plot problem, and it's a different kind of narrative resolution, because it involves the prince saving the princess, basically. It's the kiss of true love. If you've seen the movie, you know that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so Wollstonecraft, I think, would say there has been definite progress, at least if we're talking about these pop culture images of princesses. She wouldn't be a huge fan of the whole princess deal, but that's another story. So the dyad here, the pairing, is reason, and that's the good stuff, degradation, and that's the bad stuff. So if you've got a reasonable society, what's the opposite? The opposite of a reasonable society, an improving society, a progressive society, is a degraded society. A degraded society. So degraded society is like the aristocratic society, where the aristocracy not only dominates the government, but also the aristocratic values kind of like trickle their way down, and people aspire to be like the aristocrats and so forth. Okay? So that's the degraded society. What's this reasonable society. Wollstonecraft identifies it as a middle-class society, a middle-class society. And here's what she's trying to say. She's saying that, okay, there are basically three ranks. Let's call them upper, middle, and lower. And so if you're talking about the upper classes, she's talking about aristocracy. She's also talking about rich people who don't have noble titles. Say you're a big banker or a big merchant. Okay, you're in the upper class. You're the rich, basically. And then at the bottom, she talks about poor people. And she would be talking not only about people, peasants, say, who are laboring for a lord out in the countryside, working on some big manor and so forth, peasantry, farmers of European society. She would also be talking about people who are living in the city, who are, say, cleaning streets, or who are porting things around, carrying packages around, and so forth. Okay, and so those would be working class people. Okay, and then Wollstonecraft is saying there's this middle stratum, and that's where he puts most of her hopes for reason and morality. And the middle classes would be like people who have, say they have like a small business. Say they own their own tavern. Okay, and then they run the tavern and it's like a small business. She's also talking about people, middle-class people who will have entered the professions like lawyer or doctor. And as we know, a lot of these middle-class people actually ended up leading the French Revolution. So against the aristocracy, and often in alliance with poorer people. And so Wollstonecraft has some historical grounds for believing that the middle class, there's something to the middle class, there's something progressive about the middle class. What Wollstonecraft is saying is middle class men have been the ones who have been afforded the most opportunity to prove what they can actually do, not based on their birth and not based on just being born into terrible circumstances. That's the rich and the poor on both sides of the middle class. And Wollstonecraft is saying, look, if you're a small business owner or you're one of these white-collar professional types, what got you there may have been, I don't know, some stuff you inherited from your parents, but what kept you there is your talents and your hard work. So the middle class, their careers, Wollstonecraft implies or suggests, were based on performance, were based on merit. And what Wollstonecraft is saying is those kinds of opportunities, those opportunities to improve yourself, and those opportunities to prove yourself, to prove what you can do, those need to be open to all people. So she's not against the middle class. She's not against middle class societies. Her idea is this kind of meritocratic and moral improvement that the middle class currently enjoys needs to be made available and to be extended to all members of this kind of reasonable middle class society.